Every city has a geography of violence. London's runs deep. It runs through the East End pub, where a man sat down with a drink and never stood back. It runs through the South London estate, where a schoolgirl waited for a pizza and was shot through the window. It runs through the Tottenham Hair Salon, the Woolwich Bus, the Hackney Snooker Club, where a fight broke out one evening in 2009 and set in motion a feud that crossed 3 countries. London's gang wars did not begin with social media or drill music. They began in the 1960s when 2 criminal empires carved the city in half and went to war over the line between them. They continued through the estates and postcodes of the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and they are continuing now. The geography changes, weapons change. The sentences handed down at the Old Bailey grow longer with each decade, but the shape of each war stays the same. What you are about to hear will show you exactly how. Section 1, the Krays versus the Richardsons, East End against South London. The Blind Beggar pub sits on Whitechapel Road in the East End of London, a few minutes from Bethnal Green. On the evening of the 9th of March 1966, the barmaid had just put on a record. The song was The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore by the Walker Brothers. George Cornell was sitting at the bar with his friend Albie Woods, ordering light ales. Ronnie Kray walked through the door with a companion named Ian Barry. Cornell had been drinking on Kray territory, in a Kray pub, on a night when the city was already running hot. He looked up when the 2 men entered. According to the accounts that survived the evening, he said something close to, "Look who's here." Then Ronnie Kray shot him in the head at point-blank range. Bullet exited the back of Cornell's skull and hit the wall behind the bar. Barmaid would later tell investigators she remembered the record still playing as the pub emptied around her. That moment at the Blind Beggar was not a starting point. It was a detonation at the end of a long fuse. To understand it, you have to understand what London looked like 24 hours earlier, and what it had been building toward for the better part of 2 years. Through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, London's organised crime world operated along a rough geographic logic. The Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, born in Haggerston in the East End on the 24th of October 1933, ran their operation out of Bethnal Green. Their organisation, known as the Firm, controlled gambling clubs, protection rackets, and nightlife across the East End and parts of the West End. They were known for violence and for a particular kind of celebrity. David Bailey photographed them. They socialised with entertainers and politicians. They cultivated the image of gentlemen criminals, men with a code, men who kept order on their own streets and did not bother civilians who stayed out of their way. South of the Thames, the Richardson brothers ran an entirely separate world. Charlie Richardson, born in 1934 in Camberwell, and his younger brother Eddie, used a scrap metal business and a fruit machine company as the public face of a criminal empire that included extortion, fraud, and a system of disciplinary violence that became one of the most documented in British gangland history. Witnesses at the eventual trial described having teeth extracted with pliers, toes removed with bolt cutters, and at least one individual being nailed to the floor of a warehouse near Tower Bridge. The gang was run with a structure and a brutality that owed nothing to the Kray's performative celebrity. For a period in the early 1960s, the 2 organisations maintained an uneasy coexistence. The East End belonged to the Firm. South London belonged to the Richardsons. The line between them was understood if not formally drawn. George Cornell had originally been part of the East End criminal world, a member of a gang called the Watney Streeters, and had known the Krays from that period. Around 1964, he drifted south and aligned himself with the Richardsons, becoming an enforcer and a representative in dealings with the Cray side. He was known for being physically imposing, completely fearless and contemptuous of the Crays, in a way that made him uniquely dangerous. On at least one occasion, according to witnesses, Cornell had knocked Ronnie Cray unconscious in a confrontation outside a pub in Lehman Street. The insult was not forgotten. The uneasy truce broke in December 1965 at the Astor Club, a nightclub in Mayfair. Cornell and Ronnie Cray were both present. An argument developed. Cornell reportedly directed a public insult at Ronnie that touched on his sexuality. Ronnie Cray did not respond that night. But the room between the two organisations closed. The event that triggered the final collapse happened on the night of the 7th of March 1966 at Mr. Smith's nightclub in Rushy Green, Catford, southeast London. Richardson gang members, including Frankie Fraser and Eddie Richardson, were drinking at the club alongside members of another South London group led by a man named Billy Howard. Also present was a Cray associate named Dickie Hart. The atmosphere was initially relaxed. At some point a fight erupted. At some point someone drew a weapon. By the time it was over, Dickie Hart was dead, shot outside the rear doors as he tried to leave. Frankie Fraser was later tried for the killing and acquitted. Eddie Richardson was charged with the fray and received 5 years. Nearly the entire leadership of the Richardson organisation was rounded up in the days that followed. George Cornell had not been at Mr. Smith's that night. He was not among those arrested. By the morning of the 9th of March 1966, he was drinking at the Blind Beggar. Apparently unconcerned about what had happened 2 nights earlier, word reached Ronnie Cray at a pub in Tapp Street, Bethnal Green. He collected a pistol from Valence Road, got into a car driven by Scotch Jack Dixon, and was at the Blind Beggar within minutes. Dixon was told to keep the engine running. What happened next ended an era. The Richardsons were already in the hands of police. With Cornell's death, the geographic compact that kept the two organisations from open confrontation was permanently dissolved. The firm continued for another 2 years, growing more reckless, more exposed, more dependent on witness intimidation to keep the walls up. In October 1967, Reggie Cray stabbed Jack McVitie, a junior member of their own organisation, to death at a basement flat in Stoke Newington. McVitie had failed to carry out a contract killing and had been making difficulties. His body was never found. Detective Superintendent Leonard Reed of Scotland Yard, known as Nipper Reed, had been building a case against the Crays for years. Twins were arrested on the 8th May 1968, along with 15 other members of the firm. With them safely in custody, witnesses who had previously refused to come forward began to talk. The barmaid at the Blind Beggar gave her account of the night Cornell was shot. Others followed. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in January 1969. On the 8th March 1969, Ronnie and Reggie Cray were convicted of murder. The judge sentenced both men to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that they serve a minimum of 30 years. Their elder brother Charlie, convicted of helping to dispose of McVitie's body, received 10 years. The 30-year minimum imposed on the twins was, at the time, the longest sentence ever handed down at the Old Bailey for murder. Ronnie Cray was certified insane and transferred to Broadmoor Hospital in 1979, where he remained until his death from a heart attack on the 17th of March 1995. Reggie was released on compassionate grounds in August 2000 after being diagnosed with inoperable bladder cancer. He died 8 weeks later. Charlie Richardson served his sentence and was released in July 1984. The war between the Crays and the Richardsons lasted less than 3 years in its active phase. Both organisations were dismantled by the same sequence of events. Internal recklessness, a single catastrophic public act, and the eventual collapse of the silence that had protected them. That pattern would repeat itself across every gang war that followed. Section 2. The Tottenham Mandem versus the Hackney Boys. North London's Longwar Broadwater Farm is a housing estate in Tottenham, North London, built in the 1960s and covering a site of roughly 25 acres between the North Circular Road and the residential streets of South Tottenham. By the early 1970s, the estate had become home to a generation of young men who would eventually form one of the most connected and longest-running criminal organisations in London's history. They called themselves the Tottenham Mandem, later shortened to TMD, sometimes referred to by outsiders as the Tottenham Boys, or, in earlier years, the Frontliners. The name changed, the structure remained. What made the Tottenham Mandem different from the gangs that preceded them was reach. Craze had operated within the geography of their postcode and the Richardsons within South London. TMD built alliances across the city. By the 1990s, the organisation had connections running through Wembley, Harlesden, parts of South London, and into criminal networks in Jamaica. They controlled significant portions of the drug supply routes through North and North East London. Mark Lambie, one of the organisation's principal figures, had been a suspect in the killing of PC Keith Blakelock during the Broadwater Farm riot of 1985. He was never charged in connection with that event. By the late 1990s, he had become the most wanted name on Operation Trident's target list. Trident, launched by the Metropolitan Police in 1998 to investigate firearms offences across London's black communities, had been watching him for years and could not put together a case that would hold. Police eventually approached the problem differently. Unable to bring direct charges against Lambie, they targeted his associates and used surveillance to track his movements. They found him living in South London under false names, having deliberately relocated away from the area people expected him to occupy. In 2002, Lambie and Anthony Bourne were convicted of kidnap and blackmail following an incident in which two Jamaican men were taken to a flat, tortured with a hammer and hot water, and threatened with a demand for £20,000 in cash and controlled substances. Lambie and Bourne were each sentenced to 12 years. Other TMD members, Warren Leader and Francis Osei, were convicted in the same case. The imprisonment of Lambie removed the most senior figure in the organisation, but it did not stop the war that was already running on the streets between TMD and their North London rivals, the Hackney Boys. The Hackney Boys operated across the London borough of Hackney, east of Tottenham, across the borough boundary. Conflict between the two groups had been building through the late 1990s. By the early 2000s, it had broken into open and repeated violence. On the night of a club event in central London, where So Solid crew member Lisa Mafia was performing, a member of the Hackney Boys was shot, police were told. The attack was connected to the feud between the two organisations. The connection was never publicly proven, case involving Clint Ponton, a TMD-connected figure present that night, resulted in Ponton walking free. What is confirmed by court record is what happened on the 4th of December 2002. Adrian Crawford, 22, a TMD member known as Buckhead, had been out for dinner in Enfield with his pregnant girlfriend, and was driving home when a Vauxhall pulled alongside Vectra them on West Green Road, Wood Green, and forced the car to stop. Daniel Cummings, 23, a Hackney Boys member who worked by day as a club promoter in Hounslow, got out of the passenger side with a firearm. Crawford fled down the street on foot. His girlfriend crouched behind the car as Cummings fired. Crawford was found dead in the road, his body riddled with bullets. Cummings was arrested the following day, wearing body armour having anticipated there would be consequences for what he had done. A jury at Southwark Crown Court convicted him of murder after deliberating for 1.5 days. He has been serving a life sentence since 2003. DCI Julian Hedden of Operation Trident said at the time that Cummings had been a leading figure in gang-related shootings across North London, and that his conviction would have a significant effect on the violence. The months following Crawford's death saw further incidents. In April 2003, TMD member Jason Fearon was shot at during an event in Clerkenwell. He tried to leave in his car and was shot a second time. He did not survive. Police believed the attack was connected to the ongoing feud. The chain of accountability was never fully resolved in court. The Tottenham Mandem did not survive as a coherent organisation beyond the mid-2000s. The combination of imprisonments, surveillance pressure, and the broader Operation Trident crackdown caused it to fragment into smaller, successor groups. The most significant of these was the Northumberland Park Killers, known as NPK, based in the N17 postcode just east of the Broadwater Farm estate. NPK would go on to become a named party in one of the most documented gang killings of the following decade, which is covered in detail in a later section. Another successor group, the Tiverton Mandem, continued operating in the area around the Tiverton estate in South Tottenham. By the end of the 2000s, the geography of North London gang conflict had shifted. The specific border between Tottenham and Hackney as a site of organised violence had partly dissolved, replaced by a more granular postcode-level rivalry between smaller successor organisations. But the underlying logic of the Tottenham Mandem and the Hackney Boys, two organisations competing for control of the same drug supply route through overlapping territory, had not changed. It had simply produced the next generation of operators. Operation Trident's DCI head-on had called Cummings's conviction significant. The operation itself would be expanded significantly in February 2012, when the Metropolitan Police launched the Trident Gang Crime Command with approximately 1,000 dedicated officers across 19 London boroughs. By that point, the Crawford killing was nearly a decade in the past. The territory that produced it was producing new conflicts. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What came next in South London was a war that had been running since the 1990s, and that reached a moment in 2004 so publicly reckless, so audaciously exposed, that a bystander's survival became the most talked about detail of the entire feud. The gang involved would arrive in force at one of the biggest music events in the London calendar. That year, 18 bullets would be fired before it was over. Section 3. Peckham Boys vs Ghetto Boys, South London's postcode war. The Barbican Centre sits in the City of London, a few minutes from Moorgate, built for exhibitions and concerts and theatre, and the kind of curated cultural events that keep a certain distance from the streets outside. In October 2004, the Urban Music Awards were held there. Members of the Peckham Boys and the Ghetto Boys arrived at the same venue on the same night, and by the time the evening ended, at least 18 shots had been fired on the street outside. The guests leaving the awards were caught in the open as the exchange of fire unfolded. One stray bullet struck a woman named Helen Kelly. The underwire of her bra deflected the round, driving it into her breast rather than through her chest wall. She survived. Linton Ambersley, from Lewisham, a Ghetto Boys member, admitted wounding with intent. He was jailed for 12 years. The audacity of the Barbican shootout was the thing people remembered. 18 shots exchanged outside a major public event in central London. Crowd of people with no connection to either gang. with a woman's survival depending on a piece of structural underwear. It had the quality of something almost theatrical about it. But the Barbican night was not an isolated incident that came from nowhere. It was the highest visibility moment of a conflict that had been running for years across the SE postcodes of South London, and it was not close to the end. The Peckham Boys had been operating out of the SE15 postcode since the 1990s, multi-generational outfit, sometimes called the Black Gang, for their association with that colour. The Ghetto Boys were based on the Woodpecker estate and the Peepees estate in New Cross and Deptford. SE8 and SE14, straight line south and east. Across the borough boundary into Lewisham, two groups had been in persistent conflict over territory and supply routes through South London for long enough. The feud had simply become part of the geography. Younger members grew up knowing which streets were safe and which were not, and the boundary between Peckham and New Cross had a specific charge that both sides understood, and neither fully controlled. Ghetto Boys had begun to weaken by the mid-2000s. Drug addiction had taken a toll on senior figures. Imprisonments were accumulating. In September 2007, a Peckham Boys figure known as Raver was arrested and subsequently jailed after police found him in possession of a MAC-10 submachine gun, 3 handguns, 2 silencers, 379 rounds of ammunition, and quantities of controlled substances. The haul was significant enough to suggest that whatever weakening was occurring on one side of the border, the other side had not stood down. On the 17th September 2006, approximately 30 members of the Peckham Boys travelled by bicycle to New Cross. Once, members of the two groups had argued at a party in the preceding days over perceived disrespect. The group that rode into Ghetto Boys territory was armed with knives and a gas gun. A man named Jason Gale Brent, who had been a former Ghetto Boys member himself and had moved away from the gang world, was sitting outside with a friend and a relative when the group arrived. He was mistaken for a current member. He was shot and stabbed. He did not survive. As of 2010, his killing remained unsolved, alongside 5 other recent killings on the Woodpecker estate. The estate had accumulated a history of unresolved violence that the surrounding area had largely come to accept as a permanent condition. 2nd of October 2007. At approximately 6:20 p.m, a 26-year-old Polish care worker named Magda Paniewska was walking home from her shift at a Bupa care home on Manley Court in New Cross. She was on the phone to her sister in Poland when she was shot in the head and died. She had been caught in the crossfire between 2 gunmen exchanging fire in a car park outside Stunnell House in John Williams Close. Scientific evidence confirmed that the bullet came from a man referred to throughout the subsequent legal proceedings as Bandana Man. Identity was never established. His opponent, Armel Gnango, was 17 at the time and was arrested 4 days after the shooting. He had not fired the fatal shot. He was nonetheless convicted of Paniewska's murder under the doctrines of joint enterprise and transferred malice. Crown Prosecution Service described the verdict as unprecedented. The Court of Appeal overturned the conviction in 2009. The Supreme Court reinstated it in December 2011 by a majority of 6-1. Gnango was 18 when he was first jailed for life in 2008. By 2007 and 2008, the Peckham Boys and Ghetto Boys had reportedly moved toward a ceasefire. Witnesses to a separate incident in 2007 had described Peckham-affiliated members allying with figures from New Cross and Deptford, the Ghetto Boys' traditional base, which some observers read as a signal that the 2-decade conflict was ending. Senior figures on both sides were said to find the idea of the alliance disrespectful to the history of the feud. Conflict had run long enough that its continuation had become a kind of identity. What the decade between the Barbican shootout and the reported ceasefire produced was a sustained pattern of bystanders. Helen Kelly, surviving by engineering, Jason Gale Brent, dying because he was in the wrong place on the wrong estate, Magda Paniewska dying on her way home from work. Each of those outcomes was as a consequence of the same territorial logic, played out one incident at a time. Further south and west, another war was already building, and this one would last longer, extend further across the map, and eventually require a Supreme Court judgment of its own kind to bring its principal figure to account. Section 4. The Tottenham Turks versus the Hackney Turks. A war that crossed continent's green lanes runs north through Haringey, long commercial stretch lined with Turkish and Kurdish grocers, kebab shops, snooker halls, kind of cafe where men sit for hours over tea and backgammon. By the early 2000s, it had also become one of the most recognisable corridors of organised criminal activity in North London. The two gangs operating along and around it, the Tottenham Turks, sometimes called the Tottenham Boys, and the rival Hackney Turks, also known as the Bombakiller, meaning bombers, were both Kurdish origin organisations with roots stretching back into the 1990s, when the heroin trade from Afghanistan through Turkey into Europe made North London a significant transit and distribution point. Who grew up in Tottenham during that decade to describe a neighbourhood where shootings were assumed to involve one group or the other, and where the cafes and snooker halls carried an ambient charge that most residents had simply learned to navigate. Specific ignition point for the feud that prosecutors would later document in court was a brawl at the Manor Club in Finsbury Park, North London, on the 24th January 2009. Kemal Armagan, the leader of the Hackney Turks, was injured in the fight and made clear that he intended to respond to whoever had attacked him. Mehmet Senpalit, a Tottenham Turks figure, was among those he named. What followed over the next 4 years was a sequence of shootings on both sides that prosecutors would later describe in court, particularly bloodthirsty feud. On the 2nd of October 2009, Oktier Basley, 23, a Tottenham Turks member, shot and lost his life while driving in Tottenham. 3 days later, Sem Duzgun, 21, a Hackney Turks member, shot and did not survive at a social club on Upper Clapton Road. The feud was already operating on a rhythm of retaliation. David Lammy, P, for Tottenham at the time, told the BBC that gang-related activity in the Turkish-speaking community was a serious issue on the streets of the capital and required far more focused action. Yusuf Arslan, 20, of Edmonton, was among those who carried the violence forward on the Tottenham side. In September 2009, he blocked a Ford Transit van in a Tottenham street, using a silver Vauxhall Corsa out, carrying a Croatian-made Agram submachine gun, and fired 4 shots at the occupants. Both men survived by reversing the vehicle at speed. Arslan was initially questioned and released on bail. Officers later stopped him, leaving a massage parlour in body armour with a handgun in his possession. When interviewed, he told police he was one of the main players in North London and could acquire weapons superior to the Heckler and Koch MP5 submachine guns carried by armed officers. At Kingston Crown Court, he was jailed indefinitely with a minimum term of 10 years, the judge making clear he would not be released until he no longer posed a danger to the public. On the 1st February 2012, Ali Armagan, 32, brother of the Hackney Turks leader, was shot and did not survive in his car near Turnpike Lane tube station. Kemal Eren, described as the leader of the Tottenham Turks, was believed by police to be responsible. Eren was himself shot and seriously injured in Elbistan, Turkey, in December 2012. Izzet Eren, described by the Metropolitan Police as a senior member of the Tottenham Turks, was jailed for 21 years in 2015 for firearms offences. In August 2019, he was transferred to a Turkish prison to continue serving his sentence. A month later, he absconded. He became a fugitive. Moldovan authorities arrested him in Chisinau in May 2022. He was reportedly free on bail, awaiting extradition proceedings, when on the 10 July 2024, a gunman approached the outdoor terrace of a cafe in Chisinau and shot him 7 times. 41. Police believed the killing was direct retaliation for the Dalston attack 6 weeks earlier. That attack had taken place on the 29th of May 2024 outside the Evin restaurant on Kingsland High Street in Dalston, East London. 3 men, Mustafa Kizilton, 35, Kenan Idogdu, 45, and Nasser Ali, 44, were sitting at tables outside when a gunman on a stolen Ducati monster motorbike fired 6 shots toward them. All 3 sustained gunshot wounds and survived. The first bullet did not reach any of them. It struck a 9-year-old girl sitting with her family at a nearby table, eating ice cream. The bullet lodged in her brain. She underwent emergency surgery and now lives with a titanium plate in her skull, weakened on her left side, and unable to follow the childhood her parents had imagined for her. Javon Riley, 33, of Tottenham, had not fired the gun. He had conducted reconnaissance over several days beforehand, sitting at a bar across the road, studying the flow of traffic and calculating angles of approach. He helped the gunman reach the scene and evade capture afterward in a car that was later burnt out. Trial. He was asked to identify the third party who had recruited him for the operation, reportedly for around £40,000. He refused, citing fear for his life and that of his family. The gunman has never been found. At the Old Bailey, Judge Mark Lucraft KC sentenced Riley to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 34 years, noting the gang rivalry had produced numerous attempts on lives in London and abroad over the preceding decade. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A few miles south of Green Lanes, and several years earlier, a different gang war had already proven exactly the same point. The next conflict began at a pizza shop window on Hoxton Street, and the person who paid the highest price was a 16-year-old girl who had been hoping to study at Oxford University. Section 5, London Fields Boys vs Hoxton Boys. Death of Agnes Sina Inakoglu. The London Fields Boys operated out of the E8 postcode in Hackney, East London, compact area, running between the park the gang took its name from, and the residential streets of Lower Clapton. Hoxton Boys controlled territory across the borough boundary to the west, in the N1 postcode around Hoxton Street and the de Beauvoir estate. The two groups had been in persistent conflict, trading incidents back and forth in the months before April 2010. Distinguish this particular feud from what came before it was not. The scale of the violence, nor the weapons involved, nor the specific territorial logic driving it. What distinguished it was the person who was in the wrong place when Dunkley cycled along Hoxton Street on the evening of the 14th of April 2010 with a 9mm Agram submachine gun tucked inside his clothing. Agnes Sina Inakoglu was 16. She lived on the de Beauvoir estate, a few minutes from the takeaway. She had been to Oxford University the week before she was shot, visiting the campus with her school. A trip that her brother Abiola Inakoglu described in a victim impact statement at the Old Bailey. Teachers had considered her a potential Oxbridge candidate. She was described in court as popular, successful, and full of ambition. On the evening of the 14th of April, At approximately 7:30 p.m, she was inside the Hoxton Chicken and Pizza shop on Hoxton Street, waiting in line with friends. CCTV footage, played to the jury, showed Agnes in the seconds before the shooting, playing with a friend's hair. One friend spotted movement outside the window and ducked. Agnes looked up. Leon Dunkley, 22, of Kenninghall Road, E5, cycled to the window without stopping. He pointed the submachine gun through the glass and fired. He did not aim, he did not pause. He continued cycling along the road as though he had not stopped at all. The bullet struck Agnes in the neck. Footage showed her falling to the floor and rolling over, clutching her face. Mohammed Smoud, 21, of Hotwood Walk, E8, had ridden alongside Dunkley as lookout and cycled away with him. Agnes was taken to hospital. She did not survive. 36 hours after the shooting, she was pronounced dead. She had been due to turn 18 in September. Prosecutor Simon Dennison, QC, told the jury that her future was taken away from her in an instant. Court heard the two men had targeted the shop, believing members of the rival Hoxton boys would be inside. It was retaliation for the beating of a London Fields gang member in the days before the attack. Murder weapon was recovered a week after the shooting. Dwayne Wisdom, 17, of Graham Road, E8, had been arrested on suspicion of the killing and released on bail. On the 21st April 2010, officers on patrol spotted him in the London Fields area. He ran, throwing a rucksack into a garden on Blanchard Way. Inside it was the Agram submachine gun used to end Agnes's life, a pistol, ammunition and shotgun cartridges. The same weapon had been used in 6 other shootings. A MAC-10 recovered in the same investigation had been used in 4. A second, unnamed 17-year-old, who gave key evidence at trial, had stored guns for senior London Fields members. Out of fear of what would happen if he refused, a search of his home uncovered the coat Dunkley had worn during the shooting, with gun residue still on it. Judge Peter Beaumont, the Recorder of London, told him the men in the dock would not be serving the sentences they received. Had the jury not believed his account, he was given a rehabilitation order in exceptional circumstances, despite admitting drug and firearms charges. Court heard he and his family had relocated 5 times under witness protection. At the Old Bailey in April 2011, Dunkley and Smoud were each sentenced to a minimum of 32 years. Judge Beaumont addressed them directly. Gun. Violence with loaded weapons that imperils innocent people on the streets of London has to be stopped. He added that not only taken a life, but destroyed a family's happiness. And their own lives too. Dwayne Wisdom received a minimum of 10 years for assisting an offender and firearms offences. The case did not end with sentencing. On the 15th of May 2011, the 18-year-old witness who had given evidence at trial was spotted by chance in a queue outside a nightclub in Liverpool by Omazusi and other London Fields members. He had been relocated under witness protection. They chased him through the street. He reached a police officer before they reached him. Elliot Omazusi, 22, defender, who had played 50 league games for Leyton Orient and had been voted the club's Player of the Year. In 2010, convicted at Snaresbrook Crown Court alongside Jamal Francis, 21, of Navarino Road, and Shane Drew, 22, of Welshpool Street, Hackney, witness intimidation. Judge Inigo Bing rejected Omazusi's application to have the sentence suspended so he could continue playing football. Omazusi was jailed for 2.5 years. Leyton Orient terminated his contract the same day. In North London, a different set of consequences was already taking shape. 5 members of an NPK group had set out by bicycle toward Wood Green, armed with 5 knives, a handgun, and a shotgun. And the man they were hunting had run into a hair salon on Vincent Road trying to reach safety. Sec 6, NPK versus WGM. Tottenham against Wood Green Vincent Road in Wood Green N22 is an ordinary residential street. On the evening of the 22nd of February 2019, at around 7 o'clock, it became the end point of a coordinated armed incursion from Tottenham. 7 males, 5 of whom would later stand trial at the Old Bailey, had assembled the previous evening on the Broadwater Farm estate in Tottenham and parked a silver Peugeot 307 nearby. On the night of the attack, they set out on bicycles toward Wood Green, carrying between them 5 knives, a handgun and a shotgun. Prosecutor Oliver Glasgow, QC, later told the jury what they found when they arrived in Wood Green was the product of a long-standing and mutual hatred between 2 rival North London gangs. He described what followed as more reminiscent of a Hollywood film than a winter night in North London. The Northumberland Park Killers, known as NPK, had emerged as a successor organisation to the old Tottenham Mandem following that gang's fragmentation in the mid-2000s. Based in the N17 postcode around Northumberland Park in South Tottenham, NPK had been in persistent conflict with the Wood Green mob, known as WGM, an organisation operating across the N22 postcode several miles north. Rivalry between Tottenham and Wood Green had been producing violent incidents for years. An 8-week period in 2005 saw 20 separate incidents linked to the conflict between the 2 areas, including a shooting on the Broadwater Farm estate and a hit-and-run in Wood Green. By the time of the February 2019 attack, feud had accumulated more than a decade of history. It had also accumulated a presence in the UK drill music scene, tracks and accompanying videos released by members of both sides that prosecutors described at trial as boasting and threats, played out online. Camille Gabardon-Lank was 19. He was linked to the WGM side of the conflict. On the night of the 22 February 2019, he was in Wood Green with his friend Jason Fraser. 20 and 2 others when the NPK group located them. 4 split into pairs as the group gave chase. 2 escaped. Fraser and Gabardon-Lank ran back toward their parked car. The NPK group caught up with Fraser first. They surrounded him and attacked him, and stabbing him 8 times and shooting him once in the buttock. He survived. Gabardon-Lank had reached his car. He drove it toward the group, attacking his friend in an attempt to drive them off. They turned on the vehicle, striking the windows and windscreen with their weapons. Gabardon-Lank reversed away, but clipped parked cars and became trapped. He got out and ran. He reached a hair salon on Vincent Road and went inside. The group followed him in. He was stabbed 5 times. One of the blows severed an artery. He died at the scene. One member of the NPK group was stopped by police shortly after the attack, and, according to Catherine Gould of the Crown Prosecution Service, had the audacity to tell officers that he hoped they would cut down on knife crime. The trial at the Old Bailey ran through the autumn of 2019. On the 6th of December, Shireen Cookhorn, 21, of Park Lane, Tottenham, and Tyrell Graham, 18, of St Helens Place, Leighton, were found guilty of the murder of Camille Gabardon-Lank and the attempted murder of Jason Fraser. Cookhorn was also found guilty of possession of a firearm with intent. 3 17-year-old defendants, Jaden O'Neill Cricklow, of Tottenham, Shane Lyons, of Wood Green, and O.J. Hamilton, of Edmonton, were found guilty of murder and of grievous bodily harm with intent in relation to Fraser. On the 27th January 2020, sentencing took place at the Old Bailey before Judge Foster. Cookhorn received life imprisonment with a minimum of 28 years. Graham received life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years. O'Neill Cricklow, Lyons, and Hamilton each received life imprisonment with a minimum of 21 years. The 5 minimum terms combined came to 116 years. Judge Foster told the five that the attack had terrified members of the public. As the sentences were handed down, the public gallery erupted. Supporters of the convicted men attacked custody officers and attempted to jump from the gallery down into the well of the court. 4 custody officers were taken to hospital with minor injuries. 3 arrests were made inside the building at HM courts and tribunals. Spokesman confirmed the incident was quickly resolved. Catherine Gould of the CPS noted in her remarks that were it not for the actions of Gabadon Lank, his friend may well not have survived the attack. The account of what he did in the final minutes of his life. Driving his car into an armed group to interrupt the attack on Fraser, then running to a hair salon on a residential street, was confirmed by CCTV footage and witness evidence, and was not disputed at trial. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Came next moved the conflict north to an estate in Peckham, where a 10-year-old boy had bled out in a stairwell in November 2000. 2 brothers would eventually stand in the dock for it, and the case would take 6 years, 2 failed trials, and a national reckoning with how seriously London was prepared to take the deaths of its youngest residents. Section 7. The North Peckham Estate, Damilola Taylor, and the case that defined a generation at 4:41 p.m. on the 27th November 2000. Damilola Taylor left Peckham Library. He had been attending an after-school computer club and was walking home to the North Peckham Estate, a large social housing development in SE15. He was 10 years old. His family had moved to London from Lagos, Nigeria, 3 months earlier, so that his sister Gbemi could receive treatment for epilepsy. On Blake's Road, close to the entrance of the estate, attacked. The artery in his left thigh was severed by a shard of broken glass. He reached a stairwell inside the estate and collapsed. Workmen found him in a pool of blood and tried to help him. An ambulance was called, and he was still alive during the journey to King's College Hospital, Denmark Hill. He was pronounced dead on arrival. He had been 10 days from his 11th birthday. The Metropolitan Police launched Operation Seal with 120 officers. Danny Preddy, 12, and Ricky Preddy, 13, both from Peckham, were arrested 5 days after the killing on suspicion of murder. Forensic scientists examining their clothing at the time failed to find connecting evidence. Both were released. The investigation continued in a different direction. In June 2001, 7 months after Damilola's death, 4 different youths were charged with his murder and assault with intent to rob. One aged 14, 2 15-year-old brothers unconnected to the Preddys, a 16-year-old. The trial opened at the Old Bailey on the 30th of January 2002. Prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of a 12-year-old girl witness. When it emerged she had been lying, the case collapsed. 2 defendants were acquitted on the direction of the judge. The jury found the remaining 2 not guilty. Family of Damilola Taylor watched from the public gallery as all 4 walked free. Prime Minister Tony Blair had promised in the immediate aftermath of the killing that everything would be done to find those responsible. The failure of the first trial became one of the most damaging public failures in Metropolitan Police history, coming hard on the heels of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. A forensic review of the original evidence was commissioned. Professor Angela Gallup and her team re-examined clothing seized from suspects in the initial investigation. This time the analysis was different. Tiny spots of Damilola's blood were found on clothing belonging to the Preddy brothers, along with fibres from his school uniform. The evidence had existed at the time of the first arrests. It had been missed. In 2005, fresh arrests were made. Danny Preddy, now 16, and Ricky Preddy, now 17, along with Hassan Jihad, 19, were charged with manslaughter and appeared at the Old Bailey on the 23 January 2006. The trial commenced on the 24th of January. Jihad was cleared of all charges. The Preddy brothers were convicted of manslaughter. Sentencing took place on the 9th of October 2006. Both received 8 years in youth custody. The judge noted that the brothers had been 12 and 13 at the time of the attack, that they had not set out intending to take a life. The age of the offenders limited what the court could impose. As the verdict was delivered, Ricky Preddy was dragged from court by prison service officers after shouting toward the bench. Danny Preddy was released early in 2011 after serving 5 years. Ricky was released in September 2010, recalled to custody after breaching his license conditions by being found in Southwark and associating with known gang members, and later released again. In 2020, he was jailed for a further 4 years after running over a police officer. Preddy brothers had been described in court as prominent members of a local gang and had criminal records beginning from the age of 10 and 11. Killing of Damilola Taylor was not a product of a formal gang war in the way the other conflicts in this video had been. There were no territorial declarations, no organised retaliation, no named rival organisation on the other side of a boundary line. What it was instead was an illustration of what gang culture in Peckham had become by the turn of the millennium. A social environment in which 2 boys aged 12 and 13 were carrying out street robberies, operating without meaningful supervision, capable of the kind of casual violence that ended a child's life in a stairwell in under 30 minutes. The investigation's failure pointed to something the Metropolitan Police had not yet developed the institutional capacity to address: the use of children as both perpetrators and as gang assets. The wall of silence that communities under gang pressure maintained even when their own children were the victims, and the gap in forensic practice that allowed the Preddys to walk free in 2000 while different young people stood trial in 2002 for something they had not done. The formal inquiry into how so much evidence had been missed at the first examination was announced after conviction. Damilola's father, Richard, stood on the steps of the Old Bailey after the verdict and read a family statement. It said it was a great comfort that justice had finally been done. He asked that Damilola's soul could now rest in peace. Richard's wife, Gloria, who had moved the family to London in search of a better life, died from a suspected heart attack in 2008, aged 58, having, according to those close to her, never recovered from the death of her son. Across London in Woolwich, different and more recent war was being played out through drill music videos, social media posts and firearms smuggled across county lines. Reach its lowest point on a public bus on a January afternoon in 2025. A 14-year-old boy was stabbed 27 times with machetes and left to die in his seat. Section 8. Woolio versus Rivals, Woolwich's Drill War, and the bus on Woolwich Church Street, Avley, is a village in the Thurrock district of Essex, roughly 20 miles east of Woolwich along the A13. On the evening of the 20th of November 2023, 3 men drove out there, under the impression they were meeting members of a South London group to buy phones. What they were actually driving into was an armed robbery. The men who met them were members of the Woolio gang, operating out of Woolwich in southeast London. One victim was struck by a gang member holding a handgun. Force of the blow caused the loaded magazine to fall out onto the ground. The men were robbed of £4,000 in cash. The gang left before police arrived. The magazine stayed behind. Officers returned to the scene the following morning and found Brian Adu, 19, Whitgift Street, Lambeth, SE11, nearby. He told them he was clean his shoes. A search found a zombie knife on his person. Mobile phone seized from him contained footage of the group handling firearms, making threats toward named rivals, and referring to the criminal use of the weapons. The footage also referenced 2 shootings that had already taken place on the Cherry Orchard estate, Charlton, both under separate investigation by the Metropolitan Police Trident Crime Command. In one video, bullets were assigned by name to specific members of opposing gangs. Essex Police's Serious and Organised Crime Unit had by that point been tracking Woolio Group since October 2023. 3 parallel investigations were running simultaneously. The SOCU inquiry into the Avley robbery, 2 Trident investigations into the Charlton shootings. The 6 men were arrested between December 2023 and May 2024. Trial commenced at Basildon Crown Court on the 2nd of December 2024. On the opening day, Brian Adu, Stephen Ayenlai, 28, of Charlton, Rogi Bladaga, 23, Eltham, and Gabriel Adepoju, 23, of Romany Road, S27, all pleaded guilty. The remaining 2, Dave Oregon, 22, of Eddington Road, Abbey Wood, Karan Singh, 19, of Sandy Hill Road, SE18, contested the charges. After an 8-week trial, the jury convicted both on the 29th January 2025. Sentencing took place at Basildon Crown Court on the 28th of March 2025, before HHJ Graham. Oregon received 14 years, Singh received 8 years detention, Ayenlai received 5 years, Ladaga received 4 years and 6 months, Adu received 4 years, Adepoju received 3 years. Total across all 6 came to 41.5 years. Detective Inspector Yoni Adler of Essex Police's SOCU said the Woolios had boasted about their activities and come to Essex to commit further offences, and that the convictions were the result of close partnership working between the 2 forces. The Solicitor General referred 4 of the sentences to the Court of Appeal as potentially unduly lenient on the 20th of June 2025. The Court of Appeal, presided over by Lord Justice Bean, increased Adu's sentence to 5 years and Ladiaga's to 5 years. In the cases of the remaining defendants, the court found the sentences may have been on the lenient side, but not outside the range open to a reasonable trial judge. Feud that produced the Avley ambush and the Cherry Orchard shootings had played out for months through social media, videos and drill tracks before it reached that car park in Essex. That pattern, the online escalation before the physical confrontation, the footage maintained on phones, trail of digital evidence that investigators walked directly into, had become the defining feature of how London gang conflicts of the 2020s operated and how they were dismantled. The Woolwich area had been producing gang-related violence since the late 1990s, but the evidence base available to prosecutors had changed entirely. In 2023, the footage was on the phone. In 1966, there had been a barmaid who remembered a record still playing. What the Woolio case also illustrated was the cost to those used by the gangs, rather than the gangs themselves. On the 7th of January 2025, a 14-year-old boy named Kellyanne Bokassa boarded the number 472 bus in Woolwich. He was travelling to an appointment at the Youth Justice Centre. He sat on the back seat on top deck. 2 boys, aged 15 and 16, boarded the bus at a stop on Woolwich Church Street. The court would later hear they had been told Kellyanne was on the bus before they got on. They walked straight to the back of the upper deck, pulled out concealed machetes and attacked him. He had no room to move. He used his school bag to try to defend himself. He said, "Help! Help! I have been stabbed." He said he wanted his mum. His legs buckled as the femoral artery in his leg gave out. He was pronounced dead at the scene. He had been stabbed 27 times, attack had lasted approximately 14 seconds. Both defendants pleaded guilty to murder in May 2025. At the Old Bailey on the 25th of July 2025, Judge Mark Lucraft KC sentenced both to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 15 years and 10 months. He described the attack as clearly gang-related, carefully planned and premeditated. He noted that CTV from the upper deck showed the two boys smiling as they carried out the attack. One of them had thrown his machete into the River Thames afterward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 6 decades of London gang conflict had begun with 2 criminal empires and ended with 2 children on a bus. The final section draws that line from the Blind Beggar in 1966 to Woolwich Church Street in 2025, and asks what, across all 10 wars, actually changed. Section 9. The system that pushed back. Trident, the Violence Reduction Unit and the state of the war. On the morning of the 8th February 2012, approximately 1,300 Metropolitan Police officers moved simultaneously across London. More than 300 coordinated entries were executed before dawn. By the end of the day, 213 people had been arrested and 171 warrants executed. Officers seized 1 kilogram of heroin and cocaine, quantities of cannabis, firearms, ammunition, CS canisters, stolen mobile phones, and £34 in cash. The operation marked the formal public launch of the Trident Gang Crime Command restructured unit of approximately 1,000 dedicated officers that would take over responsibility for gang crime across 19 London boroughs. Detective Chief Superintendent Stuart Cundy, the head of the new command, stood before cameras and said this was a significant change, that Trident would remain focused on preventing and investigating all shootings in London regardless of the victim's or perpetrator's background. The launch was a photocall as much as an operation. The Commissioner, Bernard Hogan Howe, told the press that gang members face 2 options. Either police would pursue them relentlessly, or they could take up a traineeship. The message was blunt. The Metropolitan Police estimated there were approximately 250 active criminal gangs in London at the time. Gangs were assessed as responsible for 22% of serious violence in the capital, 17% of robbery, 50% of shootings, and 14% of rape. What the 2012 launch represented was an institutional acknowledgement of something that Operation Trident had been pointing toward since its inception in 1998, that gun and gang crime in London was not a series of isolated incidents requiring individual investigations, but a structural problem embedded across specific postcodes, specific estates, and specific supply chains that required a coordinated and sustained response. In 2012 and 2013 alone, over 4 fuel arrests were made and 91 firearms recovered under the reformed unit. Metropolitan Police data showed a 20% reduction in firearms discharges in the 2012-13 period and a 27% drop in the year to January 2014. The numbers were genuine progress. They were not a resolution. In 2019, London recorded its highest number of homicides in a decade. Teenage victims that year numbered 30. The violence that had been partially suppressed had not been eliminated. It had shifted its geography, its methods, and in some cases, its age profile downward. The Mayor's Violence Reduction Unit, established in 2019, brought a different approach alongside enforcement. Rather than treating gang involvement purely as a criminal matter to be prosecuted, the VRU directed funding toward early intervention, youth projects, school-based programs, community support, alternatives to the street-level economy. that gang membership offered to young people with limited access to any other. By the time the VRU published data in January 2026, the homicide count for London in 2025 stood at 97, an 11% reduction on 2024's figure of 109 and the lowest total since 2014. Teenage homicide had fallen to 8 victims in 2025, 73% reduction from 2021, and the joint lowest figure in nearly 3 decades. Hospital admissions of young people for knife assault had fallen by 43% since the VRU launched. The number of teenage homicides that had stood at 30 in 2019 stood at 86 years later. The progress is real and it is documented. What the statistics also show is the scale of what preceded them. Knife crime offences in London reached approximately 344 in the 2024-25 reporting year, the highest figure in the available dataset. The reduction in homicides had not been matched by a reduction in the number of incidents involving bladed weapons. The city had become better at keeping people alive after attacks. It had not stopped the attacks. The pattern visible across the 10 conflicts in this video sits underneath all of those numbers. The Crays and Richardsons operated through reputation and witness intimidation, until the witnesses eventually spoke. Tottenham Mandem and Hackney Boys operated through territorial control and tit-for-tat shootings until the shootings accumulated enough case cords to build prosecutions. The Turkish gang feud between Tottenham and Hackney carried itself across 3 countries, and 15 years before a 9-year-old girl was left with a bullet lodged in her brain. Each of these conflicts existed in the same city, in overlapping time periods, under the watch of the same Metropolitan Police, that in February 2012 launched a new command with 1,000 officers and announced a step change. What changed between 1966 and 2025 was the evidence trail. In the Cray era, primary evidence in the Cornell shooting was a barmaid's testimony and the memory of a record playing on the bar system. In the Woolio case in 2023, the primary evidence was footage on a seized mobile phone showing gang members handling firearms and naming their targets. The digital environment in which the most recent conflicts play out creates a record that investigators can follow directly. Social media posts, drill music videos, encrypted messages recovered from phones. In the Dalston cafe shooting, police recordings of Javon Riley's conversations established his connection to the Tottenham Turks before the jury had finished deliberating. 10-year-old who bled out on the North Peckham estate in 2000, and the 14-year-old who was stabbed 27 times on a bus in Woolwich in 2025, both described in court proceedings as victims of the same environment. A city in which gang structures recruit and exploit the young, in which the consequences fall earliest and heaviest on those who never chose to be part of what surrounded them. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Lee, who led the Metropolitan Police investigation into Kellyanne Bokassa's death, said the harsh reality in London is that violence disproportionately affects young black men and boys. The final question this video asks is not whether the system has responded. It clearly has, across multiple decades and multiple structural reforms. The question is what 6 decades of war, sentence after sentence, section after section of this script, actually proves about the city that produced it all. Section 10. What 6 decades proved. Pattern. Underneath every war, the Blind Beggar pub still stands on Whitechapel Road. You can walk in on any given evening, order a drink at the bar, where George Cornell was sitting on the night of the 9th March 1966, and look at the wall where Ronnie Cray's bullet came to rest after passing through Cornell's skull. The pub trades partly on the history. There is nothing at the Hoxton Chicken and Pizza Shop on Hoxton Street. Nothing at the stairwell on the North Peckham Estate. Nothing at the bus stop on Woolwich Church Street to mark what happened there. Those places became crime scenes and then returned to being streets. People connected to them. The families of Agnes Sinna Inakoju, Damilola Taylor, Kamali Gabadon Link, Kellyanne Bokassa did not return to what they were before. That is the thing that stays constant across every one of the 10 wars covered in this video. The gangs change, the postcodes shift, the weapons evolve from sawn-off shotguns and revolvers in the 1960s to Agram submachine guns in the 20s, and Zils to machetes, carried onto public buses by teenagers in 2025. The sentences grow longer with each decade, reflecting not an escalation in judicial severity, but a court system that has built up case law and precedent around precisely this kind of organised violence. The Cray twins received a minimum of 30 years in 1969, and it was described as the longest sentence ever handed down at the Old Bailey for murder. The 5 NPK members who hunted Kamali Gabadon Lank across Wood Green in 2019 received a combined minimum of 116 years between them. The tools available to investigators in 2023 – phone footage, social media records, drill music videos naming targets – were not available to Detective Superintendent Nipper Red when he was trying to place Ronnie Cray at the blind beggar. By the time of the Woolio case, the gang had effectively documented its own offences and delivered the evidence to investigators on a seized handset. None of that changed the fundamental shape of what each conflict produced. Every war in this video began with a territorial claim. Crays claimed the East End. The Richardsons claimed South London. The Peckham Boys claimed SE15. The Hackney Turks claimed Hackney. The Tottenham Turks claimed N17. The NPK claimed Northumberland Park. The Woolio claimed Woolwich. Every one of those territorial claims was maintained through violence, through the credible threat of violence, or through the cultural environment that gang membership created around specific estates and postcodes. Every one of those claims eventually produced a specific event that became the point of maximum exposure. A shooting outside an awards ceremony, gunmen cycling, without stopping past a pizza shop window, an armed group setting out from Broadwater Farm on bicycles, and every single one produced bystanders. Helen Kelly's bra under wire. The pregnant girlfriend crouching behind a car on West Green Road as Daniel Cummings fired into the street. Magda Paniewska on her phone to her sister in Poland as she walked home from a care home in New Cross. Agnes Sinna Inakoju playing with a friend's hair in the seconds before Leon Dunkley pulled the trigger. The 9-year-old girl eating ice cream with her family outside the Evin restaurant in Dalston when the motorbike came past. Kellyanne Bokassa with his school bag raised against machetes on the top deck of the 472 bus. Every war that claims to be about territory and respect, and the maintenance of a criminal supply chain, produces its bystanders as a structural certainty. The territory does not absorb the consequences. The bystanders do. The Metropolitan Police published figures on the 12th January 2026. Showing 97 homicides in London in 2025, an 11% reduction on 2024 and the lowest total since 2014. Teenage homicides that year stood at 8, a 73% reduction from the 2021 peak of 30, and the joint lowest figure in nearly 3 decades. The Mayor's Violence Reduction Unit had delivered more than 550 when new zero targeted interventions since 2019. Hospital admissions of young people for fife assault had fallen by 43% in the same period. Firearms discharges across the capital were less than half what they had been 7 years earlier. These are real reductions in real harm. They represent an institutional response across enforcement, prosecution and prevention that is measurably working by the available metrics. The 8 teenagers who lost their lives in London in 2025 are inside those numbers. So is Kellyanne Bokassa, who died in January of that year on a bus in Woolwich. So is the 9-year-old girl in Dalston, whose name cannot be reported, who was still living with a bullet lodged in her brain when this video was researched. The numbers have come down. The pattern has not ended, variable in the 10 wars documented here. The era, the postcode, the organisation, the weapon, the trigger incident has changed multiple times across 60 years. The one thing that has not changed is the shape of what gang warfare in London produces at its edges. A specific person, in a specific place, who had no part in any of it and absorbed the consequence anyway. In March 1969, Judge Melford Stevenson looked at Ronnie and Reggie Cray across the court at the Old Bailey and told them they were a danger to society. In July 2025, Judge Mark Lucraft, KC, looked at 2 16-year-old boys across the same court and described what they had done on a bus in Woolwich as clearly gang-related, carefully planned and premeditated. 56 years apart. The same building, the same structure of accountability, the same city outside the door. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.